you guys, welcome back to the blog. Today we're going to be talking about a concept and a phrase that you probably have heard me say a lot, and you probably hear a lot kind of just on the internet, and you certainly come across a lot if you're doing your own research, especially about nutrition. That's the word evidence and the phrase evidence-based. But what the hell do those actually mean, right? So most people, you might be able to kind of piece together that, well, it must be something based around evidence, right? And you might know that evidence, you might be able to kind of swap that word out with facts. But I'm about to give you a side of science and this kind of concept that you probably have never heard before. Today's podcast is going to be a compilation of a lot of different people, a lot of different stories and characters in history. And little did these people know that their kind of awesome lives led us to be able to live the relatively cushy life that we live today. So let's start this journey off by introducing a guy named Ben. Dr. Ben Rush was a physician. He was a humanitarian. He was very into social reform. He was really just a pretty stand-up guy. But one of Ben's biggest life accomplishments, little did he know, would be signing a document that actually gave the middle finger to Britain. Sincerely with love, the United States. Meaning that he lived between about the years 1750 to early 1800s. And like I said, Ben was a pretty stand-up guy. Every kind of account that you can find about him on the internet pretty much agrees. But being a doctor back then was way different than being a doctor now. There was no cohesive medical groups. There was no websites you could go on to find the latest research. There was no research going on. There was no clinical trials. There was no drug companies that had the money and the funds, and the government agencies that had the money and the funds to run trials so that we knew what really worked and what didn't. We hadn't really gotten that far as a society. Think door to door, briefcase in hand, full of sharp metal objects. Think that, town doctor style practice. Most of these doctors were doing procedures or treatments or therapies that they had either seen done in an internship they had, worked in, or they were just kind of going off the seat of their pants, guessing based off of what had worked for them in the past. This was around the same time we were finally figuring out and piecing together that a really gross hospital environment meant a higher death rate in patients. And when I mean gross, I mean puke, pee, poop, blood everywhere. And it wasn't a connecting factor. We didn't realize that having a dirty environment, especially in hospitals, was going to actually kill patients and make them more sick. We've definitely come a long way. Okay, so back to Ben. Ben, at about 1799, was being sued by another guy that we're going to introduce as journalist Will. Will was a farmer. He was also a journalist from England, and he kind of had made a name or a niche for himself in the journalist community by kind of figuring out or reporting on medical scandals. And he thought he had these numbers that proved that Ben was actually killing his patients using a practice called bloodletting. Now, bloodletting was not by any means uncommon at this time. It was actually one of the most popular medical procedures at the time. And if you haven't heard of bloodletting, essentially what these doctors would do is they would physically cut a patient open and let them bleed, to bleed the impurities in their body. The thought process at the time being that all illnesses and diseases really stemmed because of an imbalance in the fluids of the blood. But Ben, back in the time, like every other doctor who was practicing this, they thought that it worked. They had a bunch of antidotes, they had plenty of experience, and they really felt like that was what was making patients better. And if a patient died, it was just incurable. So who won that little tiff? Ironically, by today's standards, journalist Will lost, and Dr. Ben, who actually now we know was killing patients, won. But how, right? If we know, it's so obvious that if you cut a person open and they start bleeding everywhere, that is not going to cure anything. If anything, you're probably going to hurt them. Ben was a bigwig doctor, and like I said, at the time, this was just standard practice. There wasn't evidence, there wasn't clinical practices, there wasn't all of this stuff that we have now. And B, Ben was a pretty nice guy. I just said he's a humanitarian, a social justice warrior is probably what they call him now. He was just a really, really genuinely pure person. Now, thank God in the end, in the grand scheme of things, the wills of the world have won, and we now have a standard of practice vastly different than what Dr. Ben was working with at the time. But to start that story, we have to introduce yet another character. Introducing James Lind. James was a physician as well. He was born in England, across the pond, and he was part of the Navy. He was a physician, he was a doctor that worked for the Navy, so being on a ship was just part of his everyday grind. On one particular trip, James decided to really tackle this problem that had plagued shipmates for as long as really anybody could remember, where their skin would start to get really, really weak, and it would rip and they would bleed, and their gums would get really, really rotten, and their teeth would start to fall out, and they would get really tired, and oftentimes they would die. And this is what they called scurvy. Now, everything that you know about scurvy because of 5th, 6th grade, they did not know. But they did know that this scurvy problem was killing a lot of sailors, and if you look at the statistics, it's insane. But on one particular voyage, Dr. James Lind decided to kind of tackle this head on, and he had all these ideas of things that might actually help cure scurvy, but he had so many ideas that he needed to make sure that he had a way of organizing it so that he knew which of his therapies would work if one of them was the cure. So Dr. Lind took 12 sailors off of the boat that he knew were exhibiting signs of this evil scurvy, and he took them to a different part of the boat. And at that area, he split them up into 6 different groups. So he put 2 sailors in each group and gave each group a different therapy. The groups were given an array of things. So one group was given vinegar, one was given sulfuric acid, and one group was given, you guessed it, citrus fruits, specifically 2 oranges and a lemon each day. So the road to curing scurvy began. Unfortunately, it wasn't as easy as saying that James Lind found these amazing results and published them in a journal or presented them at a conference, and colleagues around the world and other doctors did the same research or the same experiment or different types of experiments, all finding the same thing and coming to the conclusion that there was an evidence-based practice. It really wasn't until other doctors kind of stumbled upon Lind's research and then really started to move along with it that we got the cure for scurvy. Lind himself did not exactly help himself either, because remember, even though Lind kind of had a hunch now that citrus fruits were probably at least somewhat of a cure for scurvy, he didn't really know why. Remember, he didn't know about nutrients, he didn't know about vitamins and minerals. Those weren't really available, that wasn't really available knowledge to him. So in an effort to monetize on these findings, an A for effort, right? He was packaging them into bottles in a liquid. He was trying to turn this citrus fruit and make it a liquid so it was easier to carry and just more convenient for the sailors. Unfortunately, whenever he was packaging that up or creating, distilling the juices out, he was actually destroying the vitamin C. So essentially what he was doing was selling sailors sugary water, and it wasn't doing anything to help their scurvy, thus he kind of was labeled as a quack. But one thing that James Lind is credited for is coming up with the first clinical trial. When he took those 12 sailors and he moved them to a different part of the boat, and he broke them up into different groups and gave them each a different therapy, that was groundbreaking stuff for the time. It was a way that we got to the trials that we run today and we hold so dearly. Also at that time, the idea that food could actually cure an illness was really unheard of. It was pretty fringe stuff. Only quacks would really believe that. How would food make a difference? Remember, at this time, they didn't know anything about nutrients. They didn't really know anything about vitamins and minerals. That was a really quackery idea. And the same was true with bloodletting. If you didn't believe that bloodletting worked, you had to be a quack. Doctors were doing that all the time, and they were the smartest people among us. Yet, both of those things were proven, either true or false, based off of evidence that began to mount. And eventually that evidence was so strong through the years that the people who had been using or doing those practices had to admit to everybody that that was not right. Imagine being a doctor in that time who had used bloodletting thousands of times and had cured some people and had killed others, and you now have to admit not only to everybody else but also to yourself that you might have actually been contributing to their deaths. But if you want an even more recent example, let's talk about smoking. It wasn't until 2 pretty large studies were actually done on doctors. The first one was done in Britain, and then the second one, after the results were so crazy, was done on American doctors, and the evidence, they couldn't ignore it. Definitely, smoking was associated to higher rates of death and cancer, lung cancer. And now, because of all of this evidence, instead of doctors being hell yeah for smoking, we now have commercials that try to scare kids away from having anything related to tobacco or smoking. All that's to say, I'm really glad that we figured this whole science thing out. Now, let's address the elephant in the room when it comes to alternative therapies and science. Most people know that doctors, science-based individuals, science-based dietitians, really scientists of all walk of life, really frown and kick and scream at what today we label as alternative therapies. But if history, we just laid out a bunch of it, shows that historically the mainstream medical community was wrong and the alternative fringe therapies were actually right and saved lives, what gives? Why does the medical community have to be such assholes? And this is an awesome question, and one I don't think gets addressed near enough. First of all, I think I've given enough evidence and enough backstory to thoroughly admit that science has not always gotten it right. Had a really rough and bumpy start, and it really cost a lot of people lives. Thousands upon thousands of lives. But those stories are part of a really rich history that has taught us so much. The scientific method that we now have, that you probably learned in 3rd or 4th grade all the way up until college, I still teach the scientific method to my freshman, sophomore college nutrition students. All of that, all the clinical trials, all the standards that we have are in place because we've learned. We've taken this really rich history where people have died and we've made hellish mistakes. And we've learned how to set up a system that will never allow us to be that way again. It will never allow us to go off of what people feel works or what people think works. It won't allow us to make those mistakes, and instead requires that therapies being used to treat really sick people have to prove themselves and prove that they're not dangerous in the process. Now, these trials, these clinical trials, the scientific process, this has vastly increased the quality of care that we're given at the medical level. It's also made it really difficult for therapies to kind of be considered evidence-based. There's a really long process and it takes a lot of time. You need a lot of other people to run the same study that you ran. They have to find the same thing that you did. They have to find that there's no negative backlash from the therapy. This is intentional. This is a good thing. We want this to be the case. We want the barrier for entry when it comes to an evidence-based practice or something that a doctor or a dietitian or another type of scientist is allowed to prescribe or give or recommend. I mean, how pissed would you be if you went to the doctor, let's say you have anxiety, and he gives you an anxiety medication, and the next day you wake up in your bed and your hair is in patches all over your pillow? I wish there was a process that this drug would have had to go through so I would have known this was a side effect. Or let's say that they prescribe you a pill for, I don't know, maybe you have acne and then you die and it hadn't been through clinical trials, and little did they know it caused heart attacks. Whoops. Now, the biggest complaint that I hear from people in those alternative niches, so alternative therapies like naturopathy, homeopathy, chiropractic medicine, all of these different fringe alternative therapies, they all kind of complain about the same thing, and that is that medicine is exclusive and that everybody in the medical community is closed-minded and bought by big pharma and super closed-minded, and the barrier to entry is impossible to reach. But what I've really found to be true the more that I've looked into this stuff is that the evidence, the strength of evidence for their therapies, it just isn't there. And a lot of times the kind of the physiology that they say or what they say is working or what is happening in their therapies is just, it doesn't make any sense from a physiological level. And physiological meaning the way that that we know the way the body works. Now, saying that, if you ever meet somebody that tells you we know everything there is to know about the body, on either side of the aisle, you should run. We have so much more to learn. However, don't mistake that from what we do kind of know. We do understand some really basic, we can observe it in labs, we can see it under microscopes. Saying that you don't know everything doesn't mean that you don't understand a small section of it. You should also run fast from people that say that the medical community will not accept their evidence or that their therapy is just too fringe or too new, because the truth is that evidence just isn't strong enough to be granted access into the scientific community, and there is a reason. And the argument that the scientific community just won't listen to the research, that is so false and so wrong. I can't even explain to you how wrong that is. I just laid out so many stories about the scientific community being forced to accept evidence when it was strong enough. And you believing that would kind of be like you believing in bloodletting or that the earth is flat. Side note, really, usually I can be nice about these alternative therapies and I can kind of see both sides, but you flat earthers are actively making society dumber. Bug off. The truth is that any therapy, any cure, any treatment out there has the potential to make it into the medical community. It has the potential to be labeled as truly evidence-based. Medicine is not exclusive. However, the barriers to entry do require that you prove your therapy actually works and that there's no really negative, harmful effects. Doctors, scientists, dietitians, other health professionals, we are not too proud to admit if a new therapy that even once was labeled alternative actually works. I've just given you plenty of stories where the medical community had to accept facts when they were presented with unwavering, super strong evidence. I mean, really, being a doctor back in the time when you were practicing bloodletting, that had to be one of the hardest things for you to swallow. Or smoking, smoking yourself and telling your patients that smoking was fine and realizing that you probably gave them lung cancer. That is not an easy pill to swallow. Yet here we are. Both of those things are considered evidence-based. Science is about helping people. Science is about helping society. It's about making people healthier, making people better. It is not about making life harder. It is not about shunning things that actually work. It's not about conspiracy theories. I know there's a lot of people out there that believe that. It's just not true. And I say all this as a dietitian. You don't think I would love to believe that food, especially organic food and fruits and vegetables, cured illnesses like cancer. I would have 2 more people in my life than I have right now. But because I know that the evidence is not there, because I know that it's just not how that works, that would be the same as me basically killing somebody, especially if they decided to do my advice of eating food over having chemotherapy, which sadly is way too common of a thing. And I have one last point for this blog before I kind of let you guys go. And that is that there has become a growing trend for these alternative therapies to kind of steal our word and say that their practices are evidence-based. And they'll say that technically they're not really wrong, because as long as you have some studies to back up something that you're doing, I mean, technically you could, I guess, say you have evidence. The problem with that being, when the science community says something is evidence-based, we mean that there are tons of big, well-designed studies that were independently done from everywhere across the world, and they all reached the same conclusion. That's what we really want. If you have 1, 2, 3 really small studies, or you have just one really big one, you can't really say that that's evidence-based. Sure, you have some numbers, you have some facts that might be a good jumping off point, but that's not enough evidence to make claims that a therapy is good. There's problems with every research study, and that's why we want as many as possible so that we can mitigate those problems. I hope that's the right word, mitigate. So just be really wary whenever somebody uses the word evidence-based. Don't just, I'm advocating for that word, but you gotta be on your toes about this stuff. Okay, so I will stop my ramble. This is the vlog for today. I hope you guys have found it entertaining, thought-provoking, life-changing. And if this episode inspired you, I want to let you know this was inspired by this book. I've showed you guys this before if you're on my Facebook page. It's called Trick or Treatment, and it is an amazing book. I love this thing so much. This blog was actually inspired just from a little bit of the book, and this is the whole thing. If you are really into science, if you're a fellow science-based dietitian or nutritionist or doctor, whatever, this is definitely a book I recommend you reading. However, because I know it is heavy and I know that the majority of my audience and my tribe probably isn't going to want to read this in their free time, I am going to go through the book on the podcast and do videos very similar to this with every chapter that I read. So the next one is over acupuncture, there's one over naturopathy, there's one over chiropractic medicine, and there's one over herbal medicines as well. And for now, don't forget to join the brand new Let Them Eat Chemicals Facebook group. Now I have a page, and the page is great, but Facebook doesn't really like pages very much. It actually prefers that you have a group. So this actually is going to be a better way for me to communicate with you. And as we kind of go through the podcast, I'm making some changes. You guys, if you followed me for a while, you notice that the video is going to be new. The blog post is actually going to be written out in long form for you as well. So no matter if you would rather watch the blog, if you'd rather read the blog, or if you'd like to listen to it, then I'm still going to post the podcast episode as well. So there's 3 different ways that you can eat this information, if you will. If you found this informative, the best thing you can do for me right now is to share this with your friends. Spread the knowledge, scream it from the rooftops, because this stuff is really important. And I will see you guys back here next Tuesday. Bye.